The smoky dawn broke on the morning of October 6th, 1944, high in the hilly ridges of the Hürtgen Forest. Rain drizzled through the dense firs, turning tracks into knee-deep mud and the soldier footsteps into slosh. Nestled in the battered line of the 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division of the United States Army, Lieutenant John Jack Morgan steadied his binoculars on the carmine horizon of the German Siegfried Line's bunkers. Smoke grenades were already fizzing behind them more than doctrine allowed, but necessity had overtaken regulation. Morgan's voice crackled through the field phone. "All units hold smoke on my mark." He exhaled. Around him the men crouched among the damp fir-needles, their M1 Garands slung, bayonets fixed, faces streaked with grime and exhaustion. Their objective was simple: prevent the German 275th Infantry Division from closing the gap that threatened to encircle their battalion and some 400 support troops pinned by artillery and enemy patrols. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What the regiment was about to attempt violated the standard rules of engagement. They were going to blanket the forest in smoke so thick it would blind both friend and foe alike to conceal their movement out of a tightening trap. The question hanging over Morgan's mind: would this improvised smoke screen succeed in saving his men, or would it doom them by drawing unwanted enemy fire or accidental friendly fire? And more deeply, how did a doctrine built on regulated, isolated smoke use designed for short-range, clean obscuration fail utterly to anticipate the chaotic reality of forest combat in Europe? The background to that question lies in the broader war machine of 1944. The Allied forces had landed in Normandy in June, begun the long slog across northern France, and by autumn were pushing into the German frontier. The hilly, forested terrain of the Hürtgen provided a nightmare of log roads, ravines, bunkers, and minefields, conditions in which isolated companies often found themselves cut off, their communication lines severed, and their supply trains choked by shell-cratered terrain. Standard training for American infantry emphasized open-field advances, combined arms loops, coordinated artillery barrages, and clear line-of-sight targeting. Smoke doctrine was similarly constrained. Tactical smoke was to be laid to screen assaults, disguise withdrawals, or mark positions for friendly artillery, not to create vast clouds of fog over kilometers of forested ridges. Yet American planners had not adequately anticipated the psychological dimension of that terrain. Soldiers were taught that the enemy would hold the line, attack in predictable waves, abide by old-fashioned rules of infantry engagement. But in the Hürtgen, the German defenders of the 275th Infantry Division used minefields, tree bursts, sniper fire from above, and mortar ambushes in the drowned forest gloom. The men of the 22nd Regiment quickly found that the doctrine of the clean front and orderly withdrawal or reinforcement didn't apply. They were fighting a spatial trap, a shifting contour of death. Communications broke, friendly artillery occasionally slammed uncomfortably close, and morale frayed as the forest swallowed unit boundaries and map lines. In late September, the regiment had absorbed losses of nearly 20% of its infantry strength. Supply trucks sometimes took 8 hours to cover 10 kilometers of broken track. Ration tins of sea rat, the standard enlisted men's combat ration, arrived punctured or missing altogether. Resupply often came by mule train or man-carried loads, and winter was approaching. The men's wool trousers and socks wore thin, their feet squelched in the mud. They knew, on half-spoken, orders that the wider plan to break through the Siegfried Line by creeping across the forest ridges was faltering, and that their battalion had been left exposed on Ridge 311, while the support companies on their southern flank had already taken casualties that removed half their heavy weapons teams. The doctrine of tactical withdrawal was clear. Don't get cut off. Fall back in good order to prepared positions, use smoke as a brief screen. But what if the prepared position itself was under siege, the roads blocked, the enemy bypassing you faster than you could react? Lieutenant Morgan and his CO, Major Samuel Dawson, looked at the map with grim faces. The ridge line on their west had collapsed. The flank company reported that the enemy had crept behind the trees and was applying pressure to the rear supply point. If the regimental command did nothing, within 48 hours their battalion and the attached support detachment of some 400 men, signallers, medics, weapons clearance crews and drivers would be surrounded, cut off, perhaps annihilated or forced to surrender. So Morgan proposed something unconventional to Dawson. "We will use the smoke not for a clean screen, but for a blackout. Blanket the ridge from west to east for 8 hours. Remove the support detachment quietly under cover. Then, once they are clear, we will pull the infantry out on a schedule. It won't be in our manual, but it has a chance." Dawson hesitated. The regimental smoke plan called for no more than 200 yards of shell smoke at any time, to avoid confusion and prevent artillery from mislocating friendly units. But the situation was already beyond standard doctrine. The battalion commander signed off. The plan was set. The night of October 6th closed in. Rain turned the branches to sponges and silenced the forest. At 2,100 hours, the first of the M2 4-inch smoke mortars fired a wavering grey cloud blooming above the treetops. Within minutes, the puffs began to merge, drifting along the tree line, spreading into the youngest firs, seeping through gullies and leaking across the fire trail path that the supply drivers would take. Over the next 45 minutes, the battalion's 6 mortar sections and an attached chemical warfare platoon, tasked with smoke operations, laid down thousands of rounds. The regimental intelligence officer later reported that more than 3,000 rounds of smoke, mortar, and hand-thrown smoke grenades were used in that operation, well beyond the typical allowance in division-wise doctrine. As dawn approached on October 7th, visibility within the forest dropped to a few dozen meters. The familiar silhouette of the ridge edge vanished into swirling grey, and to the men trying to spot tracer fire or identify enemy positions, it was a sensory ambush. For American troops trained to rely on sight, pre-registered artillery, and controlled withdrawal, the new reality was unnerving. Many men reported hearing movement very close, voices whispering, then nothing, branches cracking, shadows within the smoke that could be friend or foe. Yet this was exactly the psychological disruption Morgan had hoped for. The enemy observers could not ascertain the American positions. The flank unit vehicles slipped west under cover, and the support detachment began to withdraw. What the German forces did not expect, what their doctrine did not allow, was that their prey would choose to become invisible, to withdraw, not fighting, but slipping through the net. The veteran German battalions of the 275th were trained for frontal defense, ambushes, minefields, but not a creeping fog of this magnitude. And as the smoke thickened, their passive artillery fire registered for fixed ranges became less accurate. The round after round fell wide, and the Germans grew uncertain of what they struck. Meanwhile, Morgan's men rolled out signal cables, hooked up vehicles, and silently evacuated their wounded and heavy weapon teams. And then, at 0500 hours, the final phase. The infantry began their own withdrawal. Under cover of the dense smoke, they moved in single file down the forest track, holding positions at 5-minute intervals to avoid bunching, sending back remote flares to mislead German observation posts. By 0800 hours, the entire battalion and the 400-man support detachment had reached a backup position 25 kilometers to the east, behind the next ridge line. Not one vehicle was lost, not one KIA from the withdrawal movement itself. In the German logs of the 275th Division the next day, they recorded, "Enemy vanished, the ridgeline empty." The quiet, after the withdrawal, felt unnatural. Men who had marched for hours through choking smoke and slick mud now found themselves behind a new line, an improvised defensive position traced along a narrow forest road that American engineers had tried to widen earlier in the campaign. The moment the last squad arrived, Lieutenant Morgan took stock of the unit. Every rifle platoon had made it. The machine gun sections, though exhausted, had salvaged all their Browning heavy guns. The medics had managed to pull every stretcher case along the track, lashed to improvised litters cut from fir branches and shelter halves. For the first time in nearly 3 days, the battalion could breathe without expecting sniper fire or mortar bursts breaking the silence. Yet the psychological effect of what they had just done lingered over the men in a strange mixture of relief and unease. The infantry had been trained, drilled, reminded in every manual that control visibility coordination was the heartbeat of American battlefield doctrine. The smoke that had allowed their escape directly contradicted that. It blinded their own spotters, confused their own flank guards, and had forced them to trust a plan built less on rigid procedure and more on an instinctive reading of the terrain. As they settled, among the damp logs and the scattered ammunition boxes, many men felt a lingering tremor. They had survived because they had embraced the unknown, not because they had obeyed the rule-book. Major Dawson convened a short briefing in a makeshift dugout, using a lantern shielded with a wool blanket to avoid drawing fire. The battalion's senior non-commissioned officers crouched close, steaming gently in the cold air. Dawson did not start with praise. He began with the simple statement, "We do not repeat this lightly." He pointed to the map, spread on a plank. The smoke saved us, but it broke every rule our division wrote for forest fighting. We lost visual control. We disrupted artillery coordination. And if the wind had shifted just a little, we would have revealed our movement instead of hiding it. Morgan spoke next, quietly. But the wind did not shift. The cloud held, and the enemy had no clear line on us. One of the machine gun sergeants, a stocky man from Ohio, named Brennan, wiped mud from his sleeve and added, "Sir, the boys are asking whether higher command will come down on us for this." Dawson offered a thin smile. "There will be questions. There will be inquiries. But what matters now is that 400 men who would have been cut off are standing behind this line instead of lying out there in the woods." The forest creaked overhead, the constant background groan of old trunks shifting under. The autumn damp. The men listened, knowing that even here, even after their escape, the Germans were not far away. Patrols would come probing soon, trying to determine where the Americans had gone. They had perhaps one day to reorganize before the next phase of the division's offensive pulled them onward deeper into the Hürtgen. As the officers dispersed, Morgan lingered, staring at the map. For him, the question was no longer whether the smoke deployment had been right. The numbers answered that. 0 casualties during withdrawal, no. Equipment abandoned, no wounded left behind. What troubled him was the realization that their standard training had not prepared them for anything like the conditions they now faced daily. The forest, wet, dark, claustrophobic, had negated nearly every advantage American infantry typically enjoyed. Air support was often grounded by weather. Tanks bogged down. Artillery spotters could not see through the trees. Radios malfunctioned when water seeped into their connectors. The Germans, operating from bunkers they had honed for years, often seemed as much a part of the terrain as the roots and stones. Yet, for all these disadvantages, the Americans had shown something that manuals and doctrine rarely captured: improvisational resilience. It was not taught in stateside camps or Louisiana exercises. It came from the lived experience of men trapped under fire, hungry, cold, and forced to make decisions that contradicted their instructions. The smoke operation, if anything, was a testament to that. Morgan finally stepped out from the dugout. The rain had eased, though the dripping canopy made it feel as though the storm continued. Men moved about, quietly setting up their defensive line. Engineers drove stakes for wire. The weapons platoons positioned their heavy guns. Medics checked the wounded under ponchos stretched between trees. A few soldiers knelt by small stoves, heating what little rations they had: powdered coffee, thin strips of bacon, the familiar canned hash that some cursed and others defended fiercely. After days of stress and fear, even a lukewarm spoonful of ration mush tasted like something to anchor themselves with. At midday, the regimental commander arrived, a tall, weary colonel with the pinched look of someone juggling too many crises. He strode into the new command post. Mud spattered up his overcoat. Dawson and Morgan snapped to attention. "I've read your preliminary report," the colonel said, wasting no time. Explain this smoke. Deployment to me from the beginning. Dawson gestured to the map, running him through the decision, the lieutenant's proposal, the timing, the wind direction reports, the mortar team's careful control of the smoke density. The colonel listened without interruption. When Dawson finished, the older man pressed his knuckles into the table. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You understand this cannot go into the standard after-action report, he said at last. Division Command will not appreciate a field unit declaring that doctrine failed them. Morgan stiffened slightly. Sir, with respect, doctrine did fail. The forest undermined everything it assumed about visibility. We couldn't have held that ridge without losing the support detachment, and we couldn't have withdrawn under standard fog tactics. The colonel met his eyes. Right, Lieutenant. But wars are fought with doctrine, and revisions come slowly. What you did will be recorded under special circumstances. The important thing is that it succeeded. He looked around, as if gauging the morale of the men by the way they moved, the way they reacted to stray sounds. Then he added, in a quieter voice, You saved a battalion. Sometimes the army's paperwork catches up with reality only after men like you force it to. When he left, Dawson exhaled. That's as close to a commendation as we'll hear for a while. The next 24 hours passed in a haze of fatigue and reorganization. The battalion's quartermaster handed out dry socks and emergency rations. The mortar crews cleaned their tubes, counting how many rounds remained. They had expended more smoke ammunition in one night than some regiments used in a week. Supply officers would be asking questions soon, but the men didn't care. They wanted only to sleep, to eat something warm, and to forget the feeling of stumbling blind through smoke that stung their eyes and burned their lungs. By late afternoon, German scouts began testing the edges of the new line. Single rifle shots cracked through the trees. A mortar round fell near the southern flank. But the enemy seemed more confused than aggressive. They had expected to find Americans still on the old ridge. Instead, their patrols discovered smouldering smoke pots, discarded shell casings, and the imprint of hundreds of boots moving in a coordinated line eastward. The Germans knew the Americans had escaped, but not how or when. That night, in the dim of the forest, Morgan sat with his platoon sergeants, discussing the next day's planned movement. One sergeant, a tall, quiet man from Illinois named Hartley, poked at a stick embedded in the mud. Sir, the fog today reminded me of back home. River fog. Except at home, fog never meant death was 2 steps to your right. Morgan nodded gently. The smoke saved, Bus. But it played games with the mind, didn't it? Hartley chuckled without humour. When we marched, I kept thinking, one wrong step, and we'd be walking into the Germans instead of away from them. Another sergeant added, Did you hear some of the German mortars firing into empty woods? They were expecting us to be on that ridge. They shot blind, the same way we marched blind. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. I heard stories from the 1st Army units up north. Some companies tried using smoke weeks back and got hit by their own artillery because the observers couldn't see the markers. Morgan looked across their faces, illuminated faintly by a cigarette ember. We took that risk too, but we controlled where the cloud thickened. The chemical warfare platoon did their job better than the manuals give them credit for. That sparked a murmur of agreement. The chemical troops, the specialists tasked with generating smoke, were often overlooked, their work taken for granted. But in the forest, where every shadow could hide a machine gun, their ability to manipulate visibility became a weapon more powerful than many firearms. The next morning, the battalion moved again, this time under clearer skies. The men marched in staggered columns through open country, the trees thinning slightly. As they passed a ridge that overlooked the valley behind them, Morgan paused briefly and raised his binoculars. He could just make out the smoky outline of the forest. They had emerged from a haunting vision of what might have been their gravesite. He imagined the German perspective, staring into a battlefield that had suddenly emptied, searching for the Americans who had slipped away like ghosts. That idea, the Americans manipulating the forest itself, marked a turning point not only for his battalion, but for the way many officers began to interpret the limitations of doctrine in the Hürtgen. Over the next weeks, rumours spread within the division about a battalion that had executed a complete fog withdrawal, prompting other officers to revisit their use of smoke. Though the army did not officially change its field manuals during the campaign, experience began to alter habits more quickly than paperwork could. Platoons increasingly carried extra smoke grenades. Mortar sections requested more M2 rounds. Commanders factored wind patterns into their tactical planning more seriously. Improvisation, born of necessity, became a survival skill. But for the men who had lived through that withdrawal, the psychological impact lingered in subtler ways. Some reported dreams of wandering through endless fog. Others found themselves uneasy in early morning mists, even months later. The memory of that moment when the forest swallowed them whole and gave them cover had embedded itself deeply, a reminder that war could strip visibility not only from the eyes but from the mind. One evening, weeks later, as they camped near the village cleared by the division, Morgan received a handwritten note from the regimental commander. It was simple. "Lieutenant Morgan, your initiative was decisive. It preserved fighting strength we cannot replace. Continue to trust your judgment, even when doctrine falters." Signed, Colonel. Morgan folded the message and tucked it into his breast pocket. It was not official, not archival, but it was acknowledgement, a quiet recognition that war is shaped not only by manuals, but by the decisions of men faced with impossible choices. As the battalion prepared for its next march, Morgan walked along the line of assembled troops. The men looked hardened, weary, but resolute. Their uniforms were worn, boots cracked, weapons scuffed. Yet they were alive, 400 men who by rights, according to the cold arithmetic of battlefield encirclement, should not have been standing there. He looked eastward, into ground they had not yet crossed, and then back toward the forest, behind them. In that grey tangle of trees, smoke, and confusion, they had witnessed something rare in war, a moment when a simple tactical decision altered the fate of hundreds. And Morgan knew that long after the campaign had ended, long after the army's historians sifted through their cautious reports and cautiously worded summaries, the men who lived it would remember the truth plainly. They had survived because they dared something their training had not prepared them for. He tightened the strap of his helmet, slung his rifle, and rejoined the front of the column. The march resumed, boots thudding on the frozen ground. Behind them, the forest faded into memory, an opaque wall of trees and smoke, forever marking the line between death and survival. The Hürtgen campaign dragged into winter, and with it came a growing awareness among the soldiers that they were participating in something that history would question for decades. Even the most junior enlisted men sensed that the forest, this miserable maze of timber, rain, wire, and earth, held no obvious strategic prize, worth the blood it demanded. Yet they advanced because that was the order, because the enemy held ground they needed for the greater movement of armies, and because wars were often fought not for singular objectives but for positions that protected the flanks of far larger plans. For Lieutenant Morgan, the memory of the smoke withdrawal became both anchor and weight. In the weeks that followed, the battalion fought through hamlets whose names barely existed on any map. They took hills where the trees had been shattered into jagged spears by artillery. They crossed ravines, choked with rusted wire and spent casings. Each engagement was brief, violent, confusing, a continuation of the same pattern that defined the forest from the beginning: limited visibility, chaotic communications, and battlefield realities that mocked the carefully printed field manuals distributed in training camps a world away. One evening, after a sharp fight near a crossroads that had changed hands twice in the same day, the battalion bivouacked in the remains of a stone barn. Rain drummed on the collapsed roof, mixing with the hiss of small cook fires. Morgan sat with his journal, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself, writing notes that he hoped to one day turn into a complete account for the men's families, something more honest than the clipped lines issued by the War Department. He found himself returning again and again to the night of the smoke curtain. It wasn't the drama of it that compelled him, but the clarity. For once, the chaos had revealed an underlying pattern, a glimpse of what adaptation in war truly meant. As he wrote, Sergeant Hartley approached, helmet tucked beneath his arm. "Sir, rumour says, Division is requesting details from units that used smoke recently. Something about compiling lessons learned." Morgan closed the journal. Lessons learned. If they want lessons, they should walk 10 minutes into that forest and breathe in the mud. Hartley half smiled. Still, they're asking. Something must be shifting. It was true. Though slowly and cautiously, senior commands were starting to absorb data from the units that had been battered in the Hürtgen. Reports that once framed smoke as too unpredictable started acknowledging its defensive value. Some commanders even urged more aggressive training in fog-based maneuvers. The incremental shift reflected an uncomfortable truth. Standard American doctrine had not anticipated a forest battlefield like this. The Hürtgen forced adaptation, and adaptation once resisted became indispensable. Weeks later, after pushing through another ridgeline and clearing a cluster of pillboxes that had taken 2 days of bitter fighting, the battalion finally rotated to the rear for rest. They found themselves in a village recently vacated by the enemy. The houses were marked with shell holes, roofs half collapsed, wells contaminated by debris. Still, compared to the forest, the open streets and visible sky felt almost luxurious. They received hot food for the first time in weeks, thick stew, real bread, and coffee strong enough to make the men laugh nervously as they realized how close exhaustion had carried them to collapse. A medical team checked the entire battalion for trench foot, pneumonia, malnutrition, and the less tangible but equally dangerous fatigue that dulled a soldier's reaction time in combat. During that brief rest, Morgan was summoned to the regimental headquarters. The colonel stood near a potbelly stove, warming his hands. On the table were several typed sheets, summaries of field experiences from different battalions. "You'll want to hear this," the colonel said. "I've read your expanded notes on the withdrawal. Division command has too." Morgan's pulse quickened, unsure whether this was a reprimand or an acknowledgement. "The Corps is reviewing all Hürtgen operations," the colonel continued. "They're asking how smoke can be integrated more effectively. Your description of the withdrawal is one of the clearest examples they've received of smoke used as maneuver rather than concealment alone." Morgan breathed out slowly. "Sir, I appreciate that, but the credit belongs to the men, especially the chemical teams." "It does," the colonel said, "and I'm recommending commendations for several of them. Not decorations, we both know how those tend to get allocated, but formal commendations that go into their record." Morgan nodded. It was more than he expected. The colonel paused, his expression turning thoughtful. "There's something else. Corps-level analysts want context. They want to know why visibility control failed so consistently in the forest. They want officers with first-hand experience to explain it plainly. I want you to draft a full report, not for the division, but for the Doctrinal Review Board." Morgan stared at him. "Sir, with respect, I'm a company-grade officer. I'm not sure they'll care what I have to say." "They will if I endorse it," the colonel replied. "We need accurate ground truth, not the sanitized, textbook-aligned reports they usually receive. Write it. Say what happened. Not just about the smoke, about everything." As Morgan left headquarters, he realized the weight of the request. This wasn't about self-promotion or personal testimony. It was about shaping how future soldiers might face similar terrains. Perhaps their suffering in the Hürtgen might spare someone else from repeating the same costly errors. That night, he began drafting the report in his journal before transferring it to official stationery. He wrote about the forest's suffocating density, how it robbed units of the ability to maneuver freely, how artillery lost effect under the thick canopy, how even experienced officers misread the terrain. He described the decision to use the smoke curtain not as a clever trick, but as a necessary gamble. He emphasized the discipline of the chemical troops, the steady hand of the mortar teams, the reliance on wind patterns that could have betrayed them. He recorded the lessons in crisp, unemotional prose, avoiding embellishment. Most importantly, he wrote that flexibility, not doctrinal rigidity, had saved the battalion. When the battalion returned to the line, the landscape had changed. Snow blanketed the trees now, muting the sound of movement and giving the forest a deceptive calm. The temperature dropped sharply, freezing rifle bolts, stiffening boots, and forcing the men to warm their weapons under their coats before the first engagement each morning. During a lull in the fighting, an unfamiliar major from division headquarters arrived and sought out Morgan. The officer carried a folder under his arm and introduced himself curtly before asking to see the site of the battalion's earlier breakthrough and withdrawal. It took several hours of slow, careful walking through half-frozen mud and knee-high snow, but Morgan guided him to the ridge, and then to the point where the smoke had been deployed. The major knelt, brushing snow from the ground, examining the terrain as though it were a puzzle. "So the cloud spread down this draw?" "Yes," Morgan said. "The wind funneled it. And the Germans were positioned where?" Morgan pointed to a distant rise, now winter white. "There. That's where their forward observers were." The major remained silent for several minutes, mapping the movement in his mind. Finally, he said, "Your report aligns with what the terrain shows. That's rare. Many after-action accounts don't hold up when matched to the ground." Morgan took that as a compliment, though the major spoke without warmth. The officer stood, brushing dirt from his gloves. "Your withdrawal is one of the few documented cases where smoke was used to move an entire battalion under pressure in close terrain without friendly fire incidents. That alone makes it valuable. The review board will likely incorporate parts of your assessment into the next doctrinal supplement." Morgan hesitated. "Sir, will it matter? Will anyone actually read it?" The major gave a thin, surprisingly human smile. "It matters to the next officer who has to lead men through a place like this. Doctrine isn't about printing perfect rules. It's about giving someone a chance to avoid repeating a mistake." As the division pushed toward the Ruhr River, the battalion saw fewer forests and more open fields. The change in landscape brought relief, but also a strange emptiness. The Hürtgen had been terrible, but it had also been all-consuming. Now, without the claustrophobic trees closing around them, the men felt exposed in a way they hadn't expected. The battlefields ahead were brutal in their own ways, but the forest had imprinted itself on their minds. During one of the final operations, before the battalion was rotated out of the Hürtgen sector for good, Sergeant Brennan approached Morgan, carrying a battered ammunition box. "Sir, we're clearing out positions from our last engagement. Found this near the old line. Inside were several unused smoke rounds, still neatly packed. Guess we didn't need these after all," Brennan said. Morgan turned one of the cylinders in his hand. They were identical to the ones they had used during the escape, smooth, simple, easily overlooked amid the thunder of artillery and rifle fire. Tools of concealment, not destruction. "They were worth carrying," Morgan said. Brennan nodded. "Funny thing, sir. Before all this, I thought smoke was just for training exercises and parade demonstrations. Never figured it could save our entire battalion." Morgan set the round back in the box. Sometimes the army underestimates its own tools. As they continued clearing the area, Morgan felt a strange, quiet sense of closure, not triumph, but acknowledgement. The forest had taken much from them. Yet it had also forced a truth into the open, that no doctrine, no manual, no pre-war training fully captured the improvisational demands of actual combat. Men learned, or they died. When the battalion finally left the Hürtgen for the last time, they marched along a highway lined with splintered trees. Snowflakes drifted softly through the air. The men were thinner than when they had entered the forest, quieter, more inward, yet each step forward felt like a reclaiming of something they had lost. As they crossed the boundary of the sector, a few men looked back just briefly at the looming mass of dark pines. Morgan felt the urge too, not out of sentiment but out of respect. Not many battlefields imposed themselves so ruthlessly on those who fought within them. Months later, after the war had ended and soldiers began the slow transition back to civilian life, Morgan learned that his report had been cited quietly in a doctrinal study on visibility control in complex terrain. A single line noted that smoke, used judiciously and coordinated closely with weather conditions and organic fire support, could enable maneuver even under the most restrictive visibility. The study never named him or his battalion. It did not mention the ridge, the rain, the chemical troops, or the 1,000 small moments that made the operation possible. But it didn't need to. For Morgan, the legacy wasn't in the doctrinal amendment or the buried footnote. It was in the memory of the men who marched through the smoke and found themselves alive on the other side. It was in the understanding that sometimes war was not won by perfect plans, but by the courage to depart from them. Years later, long after he had returned home, married, raised children, and tried to stitch normalcy back into his life, he kept a small metal cylinder on his shelf, a smoke rounds casing, emptied and harmless. Visitors rarely asked about it. To most, it was just scrap metal. But to him, it was a reminder of a night when a battalion walked blind through a forest, trusting the wind, the trees, and one another. Some part of him always remained in that fog where death had hidden inches away, where life depended on the fragile edge of a drifting cloud, and where the men of his battalion, weary and mud-covered, had defied the odds by embracing uncertainty rather than fleeing from it. And in that memory, he found not pride, but clarity. In the quiet years that followed the war, the memory of the Hürtgen settled into Morgan's life with a weight that was neither heroic nor tragic, just permanent. He returned to a small town that had changed little in his absence. The streets were familiar, the storefronts unchanged, the neighbors polite but cautious in their questions. People wanted stories, but mostly the kind that fit neatly into the shape of victory, not the ones formed in darkness under a canopy of shattered trees. Morgan learned to give them what they sought, brief, harmless anecdotes, while keeping the rest folded away inside his mind. For a long time, he avoided thinking about the smoke withdrawal, not because it terrified him, but because it represented a moment when the line between control and chaos blurred so completely that survival felt almost accidental. Only later did he begin to understand that what had happened that night wasn't an accident, it was the product of experience, intuition, and the unspoken bond between soldiers who trusted one another more than any doctrine. Years passed before he revisited his wartime journals. They had been tucked into a drawer, the pages brittle, the ink faintly smudged from damp fingers and rain-soaked packs. Reading them felt like walking back into the forest. The cold returned first, then the smell of wet bark, then the muffled thunder of artillery echoing through the ravines. Yet, as he read, he found himself focusing less on the horror and more on the humanity, on the men who cracked jokes in the mud, who shared their last rations, who carried each other when strength gave out. The smoke operation, he realized, had become a symbol for something larger. It represented the truth that war was not won by perfect clarity, but by moments when clarity vanished and men chose to act anyway. The manuals had insisted that smoke was unreliable, unpredictable, even dangerous. And yet, in the most dangerous place they had ever been, smoke had given them the one thing they had needed most: time. Time to move, time to escape, time to live. He often thought of the chemical troops, the quiet specialists who had calibrated wind drift by feel, who had laid their pots with the precision of craftsmen, who had remained calm while the forest erupted around them. They received little recognition after the war. Most people never understood what they had contributed. But Morgan knew. Without them, none of the medals, commendations, or promotions given to others would have meant anything. Their skill had written a line of survival across a battlefield that had swallowed thousands. Once, many years after the war, he visited a military museum where relics from the Hürtgen campaign were displayed behind thick glass, rusted helmets, torn maps, twisted shrapnel. Most visitors passed quickly through the exhibit, eager to reach the more familiar stories of Normandy or the Battle of the Bulge. But Morgan lingered. He pressed his hand against the glass where a faded smoke grenade lay on a small felt platform. No plaque mentioned the operation he had led. No diagram explained what smoke could achieve when matched with desperation and discipline. It didn't matter. the artifact spoke to him alone. As he grew older, he found himself reflecting more gently on the war. Not with nostalgia, never that, but with a kind of sober gratitude. He kept a photograph of his battalion, taken in the months after the Hürtgen. The men stood in uneven rows, some grinning, some expressionless, all wearing the deep exhaustion of combat. Whenever he looked at it, he saw not soldiers but individuals, farmhands, factory workers, machinists, mechanics, clerks, each carrying a story that began long before the forest and continued long after it. In the end, what mattered to Morgan was not the operation itself, nor the minor doctrinal adjustments it influenced, nor even the commendations that filtered quietly through the chain of command. What mattered was that he had helped bring his men home. That was the measure he lived by, the only one that felt honest. One autumn evening, decades after the war, he took a walk through a nearby woodland. The air held the same damp chill he remembered from Europe, and a soft mist drifted between the trees. For a moment, he felt as though he had stepped backward in time. But unlike the Hürtgen, this forest was peaceful. No artillery. No gunfire. No shouted commands echoing through the underbrush. He stood still, listening to the wind playing in the branches. And in that quiet, he understood something he had been unable to articulate before. The smoke that once blinded them had not concealed the truth. It had revealed it. In its haze, stripped of sight and certainty, the battalion had found its identity not as a set of formations or regulations, but as a group of men bound by trust, courage, and a willingness to follow one another into the unknown. The forest around him rustled. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined the distant figures of the men he once led, emerging through the mist, tired but alive. He imagined their laughter, their arguments, their stubborn resolve. Then the vision faded, replaced by the soft quiet of the present. Morgan turned back toward home. The path ahead was clear, illuminated by the last light of day. Behind him, the mist drifted harmlessly through the trees, just weather now, nothing more. But in his heart, he carried the memory of a night when a drifting cloud had meant the difference between life and death, between loss and return, between fading into the forest and marching back into the world. And that, he knew, was the true ending. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.